This video is about the British countryside and the preservation thereof, which I find quite controversial, but see what you make of it. Preserving the British countryside. When you think about the quintessential British countryside, what image comes to mind? Is it the Yorkshire Dales? Or the Downs? Maybe it's the Cotswolds. According to the United Kingdom's National Ecosystem Assessment, 10.6% of England, 1.9% of Scotland, 3.6% of Northern Ireland and 4.1% of Wales are classified as urban, meaning that around 93% of the United Kingdom's land area is classed as natural, e.g. farmland, woodlands, grassland, mountains, heaths. You could add marshes to that. And about 20% of the population live in the countryside. The use of the word natural I find surprising. The dictionary definition of natural is existing in or derived from nature, not made or caused by humankind. Well, unfortunately, the British countryside is anything but. Let's consider natural woodland. 7,000 years ago, about 60% of Britain was covered by natural woodland, consisting mainly of oak, elm, ash, beech, birch, willows and, in northern climes, the Scots pine. Marshy areas tended to have lots of alder. And there were smaller bushes such as hazel and hawthorn. The remainder of the land was essentially mountain, extensive marshes, or it was exposed to severe weather like the west coast of Scotland or the Shetlands or wherever. In 1086, a sort of great survey took place. We call it the Doomsday Book. It was completed for William the Conqueror. It was all to do with collecting taxes. Nothing changes. It did not include Wales, Scotland and north of the River Tees, but the forest cover had fallen to 15%. Well, what had happened? Well, metals had been discovered. The first was copper. It came from the sort of mines in Anglesey in Wales. And then bronze, which was a mixture of copper and tin. I mean, the tin came from mines in Cornwall. Now, bronze is much harder than both copper and tin. And what did they make with it? Well, they made axes. Thousands of axes. In fact, they did a roaring trade with the continent, selling them or exchanging them for other goods. So rather than sort of meander about chasing animals with primitive weapons and traps, the populace wisely decided to stay put. They settled down and started to grow plants and breed domesticated animals, which had already started somewhere down in the Middle East. They were into agriculture, and they set about clearing the forest with their metal axes, which they did with great zeal between 2500 BC and 700 BC. In other words, for 1800 years they were chopping and hacking and burning to get rid of all this forest so they could have pasture for their animals and they could grow crops, particularly grain. Anyway, about 800 BC, people migrated north from the continent. They brought with them a new, harder metal called iron. It quickly superseded the soft bronze, or the softer bronze, in the manufacture of weapons, axes, ploughs, and sharp blades for harvesting crops like scythes. It was the real deal, this iron stuff, especially in battle. But extracting iron from iron ore needed a large quantity of charcoal, for which you needed wood. So the felling of trees continued apace, although some woodland was coppiced and was sort of recycled to produce charcoal. I mean, some people still do it today, sort of playing at the game. However, in 55 BC, the Romans appeared over the horizon, led by Julius Caesar. But they didn't go very far, and in the winter time they went back to Gaul. I mean, some of their ships had been sort of wrecked on the south coast with winter storms. But they came again, mob-handed, in 54 BC. But again, they didn't stay very long, but they penetrated inland a lot further. And over the next 100 years, more and more of them came, and they consolidated their toehold, and by 43 AD, they were in almost complete command. You know, the Scots were a bit of a problem, and Boadicea in East Anglia was a bit of a problem, but they sorted that out. Built a great wall across. The Roman Age supplanted the Iron Age and lasted for 364 years, so they were here a long time, before the crumbling Roman Empire could no longer protect Britain against invaders from the continent. What was happening, the Roman Empire was under pressure elsewhere from people like the Visigoths, a great name. And in 407 AD, after 364 years, they upped sticks and cleared off. However, we are still enthralled to iron and its alloy, steel, which is a mixture of iron and carbon. And forest clearance continued unabated to make iron in ever-increasing amounts to build ships, houses, and produce more food for a rapidly increasing population. And then as coal replaced woodland as a source of carbon, more woodland was cleared for farming. And by the end of World War I, there was only 5% of the woodland was left in small isolated pockets with no commercial value at all. As timber had to be imported in huge amounts for the railways and the mines, and left us exposed to shortages in future conflicts, the government set up the Forestry Commission, I think it was about 1919, just after World War I, which set about acquiring great swathes of unproductive land and planting it with fast-growing foreign softwoods. It was mainly spruce, larch and pine. Hundreds of hectares were planted with single species. The landscape was covered, creating monocultures like Keilor and the Glentoul forests. And there you can see Keilor Forest in Northumberland from the air. Great blocks of single species of trees, foreign trees at that. And there's a better view of it from ground level. Pressure led to the opening up of forests for leisure activities such as mountain biking, hiking and camping. But the production of timber for profit was the prime motive for forestry. Very generous tax incentives are given to encourage investment in forestry, and many owners of large estates planted softwood forests on poor land, as it was more profitable than sheep, and a lot easier to look after. The demand for softwood fell with the closure of the mines and the use of concrete sleepers for railways. But increased housing construction it's increased demand phenomenally. But more attention is being given to the replacement of softwood forests with native British hardwood species. But I think they're just playing at it. It's a bit of a sop to the woke people. During the Bronze Age, cattle and pigs were the predominant animals in the lowlands, especially in the south. But poorland was more suited to sheep. Wool had always been important for clothing in the inclement British climate. I would imagine if you were a Roman soldier when you first appeared, the first thing you'd want would be a woolen vest, especially if you come from somewhere down the south of Italy and you ended up on Hadrian as well in the winter time. So sheep numbers increased quickly, especially following the Norman invasion in 1066 and the establishment of the huge monastic estates. Fortunes were made. I mean, these monasteries were built on wool. Very powerful, huge places. Fortunes were made from the trade in wool, and it continued well into the 20th century. I mean, the city of Bradford was built on the wool trade. In the 1950s and 60s, there were more Rolls-Royce cars per head of population than in Bradford than anywhere else in the world, would you believe? Any chance that the upland regions would naturally recover from deforestation was dispelled by sheep. Upland regions were given over to sheep. They could thrive on the poor grazing of heather and coarse grasses, and they could survive in the very exposed conditions. And there you can see some sheep grazing on heather moorland. I think it's the North York moors. There was money to be made from sheep, big money. And owners of large estates, particularly in Scotland, exploited this with a vengeance by throwing off their tenants from the land. I mean, they often did this in the most brutal fashion, and they replaced them all with sheep. It was called the Highland Clearances, and you can find more about it, more about them on the internet or somewhere else, books. But any woodland sapling poking its leaves above the surrounding heather is a tasty morsel for a sheep, and is quickly devoured. If an area of heather moorland is fenced off to prevent sheep grazing, then trees appear, especially birch. But birch is often followed on by other species, ash and eventually oak. When we visit the uplands in August, especially in the north of England, the Pennines, and indeed in Scotland, we see great swathes of purple heather. It's almost unique to the British Isles, and it's a wonderful sight. Apart from sheep, on these moors, there are red grouse, which is a species indigenous to Britain. I'm not sure whether you find it anywhere else. And there is a red grouse sitting on a rock in Swaledale. It's probably got a bottle of whiskey tucked away behind that stone. It's highly prized as a bird for sport, being a fast, low-flying bird, and shooting begins on August the glorious 12th. And it brings with it employment to rural areas and considerable income to the estate landowners, but it's certainly not without controversy. And here you can see a grouse moor with a line of grouse butts, little walled enclosures where you stand with your gun and another fella as you load You blast away at the grouse and he loads the guns. It's an expensive business. Thousands of pounds for a weekend shooting. Grouse eat heather. I don't know why, because it's tough stuff. And to maintain a large population of grouse, the heather moorland is managed. All the tough heather is carefully burned off in strips, and the new tender shoots not only support large populations of grouse, but they've also led to overstocking of sheep. The heather moorland is a magnificent sight, and we could be forgiven if we thought it was a natural habitat. But there's nothing natural about it at all. The whole thing is man-made. And there you can see, this is an aerial view, a satellite view of a grouse moor, and they're all the same. And you can see where the heather has been taken off in strips. All very carefully controlled. You don't want the whole lot going up in a blaze, because that would kill off the young heather as well. So you have to take off the old shoots but leave the roots intact for the new heather to appear. Again, this burning is quite controversial. I mean, it's done in the winter time. It's not done when there are things like curlews and snipe or birds of prey nesting on the moors. But nevertheless, it's lots of the sort of green movement complain about it. And some landowners, usually not dependent on income from grouse. I mean, people such as the big water companies and the National Trust, they've banned burning on their holdings, which are enormous. But there are still sheep there eating the trees. So during the Bronze Age, the countryside changed from small clearings in woodland, sort of surrounded by forest, to little patches of woodland surrounded by cleared land. Apart from small enclosures attached to dwellings for a pig and a few chickens, there were no fields as such, as we understand them. The land was open range, and it was called commons, on which the commoners could graze their livestock and collect firewood and wild fruits, for which they paid the owner of the land a small rent. Following the Norman invasion in 1066, the country was divided up amongst the Norman elite, sort of William the Conqueror's favourites, and they built castles and big houses surrounded by walls and ditches to exclude the riffraff and prevent the deer and wild boar which they hunted from escaping. I mean, some of these enclosures were vast, you know, they covered mile after mile after mile, and they still exist, albeit much changed. Think places like Cannock Chase and the Forest of Dean and Sherwood Forest. The New Forest are examples. I mean, farming these commons was done in strips, and there are many examples where evidence of these medieval strips can be seen. You can see some there in Swaledale in the Yorkshire Dales, alongside the river. And there are some very well shown in with a low sun somewhere in the Midlands. This shows what is called rig and furrow, or ridge and furrow. And the land ended up like that by the way it was ploughed, with a single plough pulled by oxen. It tended to produce these humps. Again, you can see them everywhere. And in the poorer countries of Europe, it still exists. Well, they probably use small tractors rather than ploughing with oxen and horses. And this is that's strip farming in Romania. There you can see it in Moldova. Little tiny strips, not very long and quite narrow. And the next major change was enclosure. The farmers usually met twice a year, or the villagers, to divvy up everything and decide a programme for the year, what crops they were going to grow on which particular patches and so on, where you could graze the animals, etc., etc. In the 16th and 17th centuries, I mean, some land had already been enclosed by agreement. But between 1710 and 1870, enclosure was by Act of Parliament. And there were more than 4,000 of these acts. Essentially, if the villagers decided they wanted to enclose the land, then they had to apply to Parliament. But of course the people in power in Parliament were the landowners. There are many arguments for and against these acts. I mean, you can read about it. But the general tenor is that the very poor lost out. Even those who were compensated for their loss were usually given poor land, which they couldn't afford to enclose it. And it was incapable of supporting a family. They usually sold it, so that someone would come along and make them an offer for a bigger holding. And they went to the rapidly expanding towns to work in the factories sprouting up as a result of the Industrial Revolution. There was a mass move or during the enclosures from the land into the cities. So following the enclosure, the commons were divided into fields, and they were enclosed by the hedges and walls which we see today. If you look at Google Earth and traverse from the east coast to the west coast, we can see that the landscape is completely man-made. Whether it be farms or woodland, hedges and walls are a relatively recent addition to the British landscape. I mean, it would be an almost unrecognisable landscape to a 17th century farmer. So this is Google Earth. If we start on the northeast coast and work our way across to the west coast, we cover a fair lots of different terrains. If we zoom in, we can have a look at it closely. We'll start at Scarborough. Most people know where Scarborough is. It's the very first Victorian seaside town. Obviously the town itself is man-made, so if we just move it across and have a look just inland, see what we get. And anyway, you can see all these little enclosed boxes where there used to be common land. And we just move in a little bit further. Just zoom in on there. And you can see there that this is a forest. Again, man-made of softwood, foreign trees. Spruce, larch and pine essentially. Acres and acres and acres of it. I just move across a little bit further. And again, more of it. No natural woodland at all. All will be forest. And again further across, great patchwork of enclosures. It doesn't really matter where you go. You can zoom around on here with your eyes shut. This is the Vale of York. The whole thing is just a patchwork of little boxes, most of which didn't exist before 1750. It was all open. And just continue across. Here we have the swale again. Thousands of little boxes, and Leeming Air Base. This is Wensleydale, the famous cheese, Wensleydale cheese place is there. Actually, of course, famous for all creatures great and small. So this is Heriot country. Again, all man-made. What about the moor tops? Have a look at the heather moors. See what we get there. Very famous shooting part of the world. And you can see just how well managed these heather moorlands are. When you go up there, it's all wall-to-wall heather. And you think it's all natural. Not a bit of it. The whole thing is man-made. And these are the Pennines and beyond. Up there is the Eden Valley. That is the hold on still. That there is the Carlisle to Settle railway line. One of the last railway lines to be built in the country, but I think it opened in the 1870s. And this is the southern part of the Lake District. And if you look on this particular fell top here, let's just zoom in on it. There you can see walls, long walls. You can just look at this one here. Starts at this little lake here, little pond or tarn. All the way up to here. Push across to the west coast. Again, enclosures. Here's one of the southern fells. Stone walls running for miles. And come down onto the lower pastures. And here we are in the Lake District again, all enclosed apart from the very tops of the fells. And what happened on the tops of the fells was there were usually cairns placed at convenient points rather than building mile after mile after mile of stone wall. Cairns were placed in it, usually with the initials of the landowner on them. And there we are at St Bees Head. And again, enclosures. This is Kent. Again, man-made forests. Hundreds of little tiny enclosures. Much smaller than the ones up north, in fact. All the way to Land's End. Little tiny fields. All privately owned. by hundreds or tens of thousands of individuals. And this is northern France. We've got huge open spaces divided off, but not by hedges or walls, just by different crops, which you can see there. It's a bit like similar to strip farming, only on a grander scale. As you move across the landscape, you come across this more modern phenomenon, taking up valuable agricultural land or land which could be used for woodland. You get these strange coloured fields. We just zoom in on them. They're really interesting. These are acres of solar panels. More and more of them are appearing. As I travel by train down to London, you see them. Every time you go, there are more and more of them. I mean, look how many solar panels there are there. Crikey. Hundreds, if not thousands. Yeah. There are some more. Beach growing crops, or keeping animals, no hassle at all, just collect the money. If Enclosure Acts came along today, would we allow enclosure of the commons into sort of zillions of little privately owned boxes called fields? I wonder. And there's a superb example of enclosures with stone walls in the Yorkshire Dales. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles of this stuff, stone wall. But it was all brand new about 300 years ago. The great areas of marshland, such as the fens in East Anglia, they were drained and enclosed. A place like the Somerset Levels, another one. During the medieval period, peat was dug from bogs as a fuel, especially where there was a lack of trees. And East Anglia had tons of the stuff, which the monastic owners excavated and sold to the nearby towns like Norwich and Great Yarmouth and Ipswich. But as the sea level began to rise, water began to encroach on these excavations, on these peat excavations. So they built windmill-powered pumps to try and prevent the flooding, but there was no holding it back. And the excavations were, eventually they were overwhelmed, forming the 40 small lakes called the Broads, which we see today. And there's a little map showing most of them, or perhaps not, showing some of them. And there's a lovely picture of two of them. But in amongst them, you notice, it's fields. And there's a typical broad scene. Reed beds almost as far as the eye can see, and a windmill pump, which seems to be in remarkably good condition. Most of them are in ruins. Some of them are preserved, and some of them, in fact, still work. Although usually pumping is done using internal combustion engines. Probably diesel would whisper that. Now, as water passes through reeds, and as the reeds sort of die off and fall into the water, you tend to get silting up, and eventually trees manage to get a hold. Things like willow very quickly gets a hold. But the Broads the area is very heavily managed. I mean, it's a national park, or if it isn't a national park, there's something akin to a national park. And any silting up or scrub growth is very, very quickly cleared away. I mean, the reed beds are a very important habitat for birds and insects, especially in the summertime when they return from abroad. Things like reed warblers and cuckoos and so on, and they don't want it to returning to scrub woodland. Although that would be the natural progress. That happens to all marshes. They eventually become woodland. What we designate as greenbelt, areas of outstanding natural beauty, these ONBs, and national parks, are man-made. There is next to no natural countryside left. We've destroyed it all in the pursuit of cash. I mean, it may be beautiful, but let's not kid ourselves that it's natural. There are many organisations determined to preserve this landscape using the statutory acts of Parliament, such as the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981. And there are lots of voluntary organisations, such as the many wildlife trusts, things like the Woodland Trust, and counties usually have their own wildlife trust. And we pay farmers subsidies, substantial subsidies in many cases, to preserve this man-made landscape. And without them, lots of little farms, particularly up in the dales and the lakes, would be completely uneconomical, and the land would eventually return to its natural state, so-called wilding. I mean, some big landowners have done this deliberately. Then you get increased biodiversity and more carbon capture and reduced flooding. Although in France, where lots of people have abandoned farms, they've been planted up with forest, with woodland. When we look at the photographs of palm oil plantations in clearances in Indonesia surrounded by natural rainforest, or of clearances caused by logging or increased ranching of beef cattle in the Amazon forests, or maybe an encroachment by cattle farmers on the grasslands of Africa, etc., we tend to be outraged, especially if it involves the large animals we see on our television screens. It's a disaster for many of the native species, there's no two ways about it. We tend only to think of the large mammals, the orangutan, gorilla, rhino, snow leopard, elephant and tigers and so on. I mean, television is full of it. The poor wildebeest and other antelopes, they only appear as extras for the chase, the killing and the tearing apart thereof. We know about the dodo, that extinct bird, but millions of other species have become extinct because of human activity in the last few hundred years, and the rate of extinction is rapidly increasing. 400 species have disappeared from Britain during the last 200 years, and many others, such as the warm furry wildcat predator, and the wart-biter cricket, there is such a thing, are on the verge of extinction. I mean, it is tragic, but the indigenous populations, the people who live there, in these environments we wish to protect, are very poor. But they have the same wishes as we have. They want clean water, electricity, good health, material goods, motor cars and washing machines, even a bike in some cases. They want good food, they want education, decent roads, houses and so on. These things cost money, lots of money. And to get it, they're exploiting their land for cattle, crops, timber, metal ores, fossil fuels, quack medicines, hydroelectricity, roads and houses, just as we've been doing for thousands of years. And we compound the problem, as we see it, by providing the market for these things. For us to whinge about it brings to mind the words pot, kettle and black, if not worse. And increased tourism, it doesn't come anywhere near solving the problem. I mean, in some cases, it only makes it worse. And here you can see cattle being raised on cleared rainforest in Brazil. Now look at the two photographs below. Is there any real difference between them? This is a palm oil plantation in Indonesia. From the top right of the picture you can see the indigenous rainforest. This is in England. Great swathes of oilseed rape and monoculture, and very little woodland to be seen. There's no real difference, apart from the crop. Palm oil products range from food to cosmetics, and it's almost impossible to avoid them, if that's the path you choose to take. And there's a little palm showing you what this palm oil is used for. It seems to be mainly used in cooking, but it has many other uses which you can see there. The clearance of woodland, draining of marshland, enclosure of commons and introduction of sheep was also a disaster for wildlife in Britain. As the populations of deer, wild boar, beavers and auroch, these wild cattle, were decimated, the large predators such as the wolves, the bears and the lynx disappeared. We shot them, trapped them, poisoned them, gassed them and destroyed their habitat until there were none left. And we're still at it. I think badgers are on the list next. My childhood was filled with the rasping sound of corncrakes in almost every field. It's now a distant memory. Cuckoos, skylarks and hedgehogs and others are going the same way. I mean, is it likely that we will return to the old ways to increase our dwindling species, the old hay meadows, harvesting with size, no pesticides or herbicides, and banning of oilseed rape and maize and other crops? Not a chance. Not a chance. So from the Bronze and Iron Ages through the Roman occupation, the Saxon occupation, the Middle Ages and the Enclosure Acts of the 18th century, we were there first. Had made a magnificent job of totally destroying our natural countryside. We beat them to it by 1,000 years. But when they do it, we bleat loudly when they clear their land for cash. These Brazilians and Indonesians and Africans. When you open a wrapper on your bar of chocolate, or eat your beef burger, do you detect a faint whiff of hypocrisy? Compared with our European neighbours, Britain has a derisory amount of native countryside. scattered in little tiny pockets of land, usually inaccessible to grazing animals and of no agricultural value. If we want to enrich our countryside, we not only need to value and protect these treasures, but we need to expand them enormously. And it will be a very long-term project. Trees aren't exactly quick-growing things. And it's going to require a great deal of money and the will to do it. And bearing that in mind, optimism doesn't come to mind. We need millions, if not billions, of trees. So just in case you think that the British countryside isn't going to change, drastically in any way, here are 3 images to dispel any dreams of an unchanging British countryside. So there's a map showing all the wind farms which exist or are proposed now that the ban on onshore wind farming has been lifted. So there's number 2. And there is number 3. What is it we try to preserve? I mean, is the British countryside to be some kind of museum? Agriculture is an industry. It's a big industry. The British countryside has changed almost beyond all recognition in my lifetime. The crops are different, the livestock is different, every hedge looks the same, the old cart sheds, fold yards and byres have been replaced with huge farm buildings. Modern farm machinery is massive and complex, and it will continue to change as the climate changes. The notion of a quintessential British countryside is a total myth, dreamed up by those who think we should have kept village pumps, Spitfires, gas lights, steam-fired railway engines, red phone boxes in every village, and the 11 plus. Anyway, on that controversial note, we'll see you again. Take care. Bye-bye.